1175 BCE, the Nile Delta, Egypt. An ancient kingdom waits on the edge of ruin as dawn rises slowly over the marshlands, turning the water into pale gold that conceals the violence gathering beneath it. The air hangs thick and unmoving, saturated with the scent of silt and river grass. Reeds stand as silent sentinels along the banks, their shadows trembling only when hidden archers shift their weight in the mud. No voices carry across the marsh, no commands echo. The world seems to tighten, bracing for a collision that has not yet begun. Through the haze, dark shapes glide forward, broad, proud ships of the sea peoples, advancing in a steady, relentless rhythm. Oars lift and plunge in unbroken cadence. Shields line the hulls. Helms crest against the rising sun. Behind the warriors stand families, livestock, carts, and everything salvaged from a world collapsing behind them. They come not as raiders, but as a migrating people seeking to claim Egypt's fertile delta as their new home. Egyptian warships wait in silence, concealed in reed-choked channels. Archers draw their bows, breath held, eyes fixed on an enemy drifting unknowingly into a labyrinth engineered to hold them. The delta itself has become a weapon, its waterways reshaped into corridors of entrapment. The stillness before impact stretches thin, trembling with the weight of everything at stake. In a single moment, the fate of kingdoms closes around the narrow throat of the delta. This is the story of how Egypt survived the storm. This is the Battle of the Delta. The calm that precedes the Delta ambush had been earned through an earlier storm. A few years before the moment when Egyptian archers waited in the reeds, the northern frontier of the kingdom had witnessed another confrontation, one that revealed both the scale of the threat and the desperation driving it. The Battle of Jahi in 1178 BCE had ended with a battered but victorious Egyptian army standing over a landscape stripped of order. Fields lay crushed beneath the wheels of shattered chariots. Broken helmets glinted faintly in the dust. Spears lay scattered like the remnants of a failed harvest. Ramesses III had halted the first major push of the Sea Peoples on land, striking them along a coastal route that linked Syria to Canaan. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu later declared the encounter a triumph, the pharaoh turning back a tempest that had swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Yet even those official accounts, carved with deliberate grandeur, could not disguise the deeper reality. The people who lay dead on the field at Jahi were only part of a far larger movement, a confederation of displaced groups pushed south by famine, political collapse, and the destruction of their former homelands. Reports gathered in the days after the battle made this clear. Survivors from the defeated columns had not dissolved into the countryside or retreated northward. Instead, they had moved purposefully toward the coast. Egyptian scouts observed ships waiting offshore, broad, sturdy vessels carrying more than warriors. Women tended cooking fires on their decks. Children sheltered beneath woven canopies. Livestock and carts were lashed to the hulls. This was not a raiding force regrouping. It was a traveling world searching for a place to settle. Behind the Sea Peoples lay the ruins of cities in Anatolia, Syria, Cyprus, and the Aegean. Ahead of them, the Nile Delta offered something rare in a collapsing age: stable floodwaters, organized administration, and fields that still produced grain. Egypt's survival had turned it into a destination. If that delta could be seized, the Confederation would gain not only safety, but control over one of the richest agricultural regions of the eastern Mediterranean. Ramesses III and his advisors understood the stakes. The Battle of Jahi had revealed the threat. The movement did not stop. It simply shifted from land routes to the sea. If the Sea Peoples succeeded in forcing a permanent foothold in the delta, Egypt would likely follow the path of the Hittites and Ugarit into fragmentation and silence. The Battle of the Delta would decide whether that future took root. In the years surrounding the Battle of Jahi, the wider Mediterranean world unraveled with startling speed. Great powers that had endured for centuries collapsed in rapid succession, leaving behind only charred ruins and scattered refugees. The fall of these kingdoms formed the backdrop against which Egypt now prepared to defend itself. What approached the Nile Delta was not simply an invading army, but the final surge of a regional catastrophe. Across Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, long a rival to Egypt, had already fractured under the combined strain of famine, internal succession crises, and the relentless pressure of migrant groups pushing from the west. Its capital, Hattusa, once a center of diplomatic and military authority, had been abandoned and set ablaze. The archives that had documented treaties, wars, and royal lineages were left buried beneath collapsed stone. What had been one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age vanished within a generation. Farther south, the city of Ugarit suffered a similar fate. Letters recovered from its final days revealed the desperation of its rulers, pleading for assistance as enemy ships approached its harbors. Relief never reached them. Excavation layers show the sudden, violent destruction of buildings still stocked with goods, suggesting a flourishing port city overrun too quickly to evacuate. Cyprus faced upheaval as well. Once a stable center of copper production, it saw its settlements burned, disrupted, or abandoned, breaking the trade routes that linked the Mediterranean economy together. Throughout these regions, famine left deep marks on the archaeological record. Grain shortages appear in tablets and correspondence, and skeletal remains show signs of malnutrition. Earthquakes added further instability, damaging fortresses and storehouses at precisely the moment when populations were least able to rebuild. Trade networks that had carried goods between Mycenae, Egypt, Hatti, Cyprus, and Canaan faltered, leaving entire societies vulnerable to scarcity. Into this landscape of upheaval moved the Sea Peoples, a loose coalition of groups whose origins lay in multiple regions affected by collapse. Their names appeared in Egyptian inscriptions as Sherdun, Shekelesh, Jeker, Danuna, Weshesh, and the Peliset, each likely representing a different community displaced by destruction or seeking opportunity amid disorder. They were not a single kingdom or empire. They were a confederation forged by necessity, growing stronger as cities fell before them. Their migrations followed a discernible pattern across the archaeological footprint of the era. Arrival by land or sea, conflict with local populations, destruction of settlements, and eventual movement toward new territories. In some regions, they settled permanently. In others, they passed through after exhausting local resistance or resources. Everywhere they went, their presence marked the end of established political orders. Egypt, protected by geography and the strength of its administration, stood apart from the chaos, but could not escape its gravity. Letters sent to the court at Thebes warned of burning cities to the north, of peoples on the move, of coastal lands emptied of inhabitants. Officials recognized the pattern unfolding across the Levant and understood what it meant. If unchecked, the Sea Peoples would continue their march until they reached the Nile itself. In a world of shrinking options, Egypt's delta stood out as the last great prize. Against this backdrop of collapsed kingdoms and displaced populations, the conflict between Egypt and the Sea Peoples took on a scale larger than any one battle. It became the final contest in a Mediterranean world on the brink of transformation. Amid the turmoil sweeping the Mediterranean, Egypt prepared for a confrontation that would determine whether it remained the last great power of the late Bronze Age, or joined the ruins scattered across the coastlines of the region. After the reports from Jahi confirmed that the Sea Peoples had regrouped at sea, Ramesses III moved with deliberate urgency. He recognized that the land victory had exposed only a fraction of their strength. What approached now was a maritime force supported by entire populations, not merely military bands. It would strike not at Egypt's borders, but at the heart of its river mouths. Egypt's intelligence network, refined through centuries of imperial rule, tracked the Confederation's movements along the coast. Messengers rode from fortress to fortress, carrying descriptions of ships crowded with warriors, women, children, and supplies. The scale of the migration made clear that this was not a raid. It was an attempt to carve out permanent settlement within the fertile lands of the Nile Delta. Ramesses III understood the implications. If the Sea Peoples established a foothold, Egypt's agricultural center, trade routes, and political stability would fracture in ways impossible to reverse. The coming battle was therefore not about repelling a raid, it was about denying the birth of a rival society inside Egypt's own heartland. The pharaoh responded with a strategy rooted in both tradition and adaptation. Egypt had long cultivated strengths that made it formidable in confined spaces. Disciplined archers capable of rapid, continuous fire, a riverine fleet designed for maneuverability, marines trained for boarding actions, and a chariot corps able to move swiftly along levees and causeways. These forces had served Egypt well in previous campaigns, but the nature of the coming battle required something more than conventional military engagement. It demanded a controlled environment, a battlefield engineered rather than found. Ramesses selected the delta's labyrinth of channels as the setting for his defense. Here, narrow waterways, shifting banks of reeds, and concealed sandbars could be turned to advantage. The Sea Peoples relied on heavy, broad-based ships suited to open water and coastal raiding. Within enclosed channels, these vessels would lose their mobility. Their size would become a liability, their confidence a trap. Egyptian engineers and sailors placed underwater obstacles, stakes, ropes, nets, beneath the surface to tear at hulls and impede withdrawal. The terrain itself would grip the enemy, making retreat nearly impossible once the battle began. Preparations unfolded across the delta with disciplined efficiency. Shipwrights reinforced hulls and tested oars. Armorers inspected arrowheads, binding new ones to shafts in long rows along the quays. The granaries near Memphis and Ramesses released stores to feed the assembled troops. Administrative papyri recorded the movement of rations, tools, and conscripts with exacting detail, reflecting a state capable of mobilizing at scale even amid regional instability. Priests performed rituals in major temples, invoking divine favor to strengthen the resolve of soldiers and sailors. Offerings were made to the gods associated with protection, kingship, and the waters of the Nile. These ceremonies reinforced the ideological foundation of Ramesses' rule, the king as defender of order, standing against the forces of chaos represented by the encroaching confederation. To many Egyptians, the Sea Peoples were not simply migrants or invaders. They were the earthly manifestation of the disorder consuming the world beyond their borders. As preparations reached their peak, Ramesses III reviewed his forces. He saw archers seasoned by decades of military tradition, sailors familiar with every nuance of the delta's tides, and charioteers trained to move with precision across narrow embankments. He had crafted a battlefield where Egyptian strengths would be amplified and enemy advantages neutralized. Every unit, every reed bank, every concealed waterway served a single purpose: to ensure that the Sea Peoples never gained a foothold in Egypt. The plan was set. The delta would become a trap, and Egypt would meet its greatest challenge in a battle shaped not by chance, but by design. As Egypt strengthened its defenses, the Sea Peoples resumed their advance with measured purpose. Their failed attempt to break through at Jahi had not ended their movement, it had redirected it. What had once been a march along the coastal roads of Canaan transformed into a coordinated maritime push, drawing together groups scattered across the collapsing shores of the Mediterranean. Their destination was no longer a passage through Egyptian territory, but the land itself. The delta, rich in silt and water, represented stability in a world stripped of it. Archaeological evidence and Egyptian reliefs reveal the ships that carried them southward, broad, sturdy vessels with high prows carved in the shapes of birds or simple, curving timbers. Warriors occupied the outer edges, shields stacked along the rails, spears angled upward like forest undergrowth. Behind them, families sheltered beneath woven mats and leather canopies, tending fires in clay vessels secured to the deck. Children clung to ropes or bundles of possessions as the sea swayed under their feet. These were not temporary raiders. They carried with them the material weight of permanent migration. Every bundle, every animal, every family aboard those decks pointed toward the same conclusion. They did not plan to leave the Nile once they reached it. Their armament reflected the cultural diversity of the Confederation. Some warriors bore the distinctive horned or feathered helmets depicted at Medinet Habu. Others carried round shields with central bosses, or the long slashing Naue II swords that had spread across the Mediterranean in the final decades of the Bronze Age. The variety of equipment suggests not a single origin point, but a coalition shaped by shared necessity. Each group had been displaced by famine, conflict, or the collapse of nearby powers, and together they had become a force capable of overwhelming weakened states. As the fleet moved south, it passed coastlines marked by the ruins of burned towns and empty fortresses. These landscapes offered no resistance. Many communities had already fallen to earlier waves of migrants or abandoned their homes to escape famine. With each league of shoreline behind them, the Sea Peoples grew more certain that Egypt, too, would yield. Reports of previous victories against Hittites, Ugarit, and settlements in Cyprus had strengthened their confidence. Egypt's victory at Jahi, though significant, had not diminished their belief that eventual settlement in the Delta was possible. Egyptian scouts watched their approach from fortified outposts, sending riders ahead to warn Ramesses III of the fleet's size and composition. The messages described dozens of ships, then more, enough to fill the horizon when viewed from the bluffs north of the Delta. Each dispatch confirmed the same truth. The Sea Peoples were coming in numbers sufficient to overwhelm any unprepared coastline. News of the impending invasion spread through Delta villages. Farmers heard rumors of ships crowded with warriors moving steadily southward. Fishermen reported seeing smoke from campfires on distant beaches. Anxiety rippled through communities that depended on the Nile's predictability, contrasting sharply with the disorder advancing across the sea. By the time the first prows reached the outer channels of the Delta, the pattern of movement had become clear. The Sea Peoples were not seeking passage. They were seeking a home, and they believed they would find it in Egypt. Egypt prepared the Delta not as a defensive frontier, but as a deliberate machine of entrapment. In the days before the Sea Peoples arrived, Ramesses III's strategy unfolded across the waterways with meticulous precision. Units moved through the marshlands at night to avoid detection, their footsteps softened by mud and reeds. The channels, deceptively calm in daylight, concealed obstacles placed beneath the surface. Wooden stakes angled to tear at hulls, nets woven to ensnare oars, and ropes stretched between sandbars to limit escape. These structures remained invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. For the Sea Peoples, they would materialize only in the moment when turning back became impossible. Egyptian archers positioned themselves along the banks, blending into the landscape. Their quivers lay open beside them, arrowheads catching only the faintest glint of dawn. Each man had been trained to fire quickly and accurately from a fixed position, a skill perfected over centuries of warfare in the Nile Valley. Their vantage points along raised embankments gave them a wide arc of fire, and their placement ensured that enemy ships entering the channels would be exposed from the moment the ambush began. Farther in, Egyptian warships waited behind reed thickets and narrow inlets. These vessels were smaller and more maneuverable than those of the Sea Peoples, built for the shallow, shifting waters of the Delta. Crews sat silent at their oars, breathing in the humid air, listening to the soft creak of ropes strained by the slow tide. Their commanders studied the channels constantly, rehearsing the movements they would make once the invaders crossed the threshold marked out by Ramesses' plan. On the levees running parallel to the waterways, chariot teams held position. Horses stamped against the packed earth, unsettled by the thick heat. Charioteers kept their reins tight, ready to intercept any warriors who managed to break free of the water and attempt a landing. They were the final barrier in a layered defense designed to deny the Sea Peoples the one thing they needed most: landfall. If even a fraction of the fleet secured ground and time to fortify it, the Delta could become theirs in all but name. As dawn approached, the Delta entered a state of suspended stillness. The air thickened with moisture. Reeds trembled under the movement of hidden soldiers. Every sound gained weight. The ripple of water against a hull, distant cry of a bird, the faint clatter of armor shifting on a waiting archer's shoulder. Egypt's forces held themselves in restraint, knowing that the first movement would unleash a sequence from which there could be no retreat. The Sea Peoples drew nearer, their ships visible now as blurred silhouettes through the rising haze. Oars dipped in long, steady strokes. Hulls glided toward the constricted channels carved between reed beds and sandbars. The Egyptians watched, unmoving. And as the first prows crossed fully into the trap, the narrative shifts. Past becomes present. The ambush tightens around them. The delta awakens. The battle begins. The moment the Sea People's prows cross into the narrow channels, the stillness fractures. The delta exhales a long-held breath, and the battle begins. What was silent becomes charged with motion. The water darkens beneath the shadow of advancing hulls. The Egyptians feel the shift before they see its full shape. The sea-worn ships pressing forward with the confidence of a force that has swept aside kingdoms. The invaders row in a steady rhythm, unaware that each stroke carries them deeper into a planned constriction. Their vessels, built for long-distance travel and hard coastal landings, move awkwardly through the tight passages. Oars scrape reeds. Hulls bump against sandbars just beneath the surface. Yet they continue, tightening their own formation with each reduction of space. Families cluster near the center of the decks, while warriors hold the perimeter, helmets rising and falling with the rowers' motion. Egyptian archers remain hidden until the last possible moment. The Sea People's lead ships pass the point marked by Ramesses III's scouts, a line invisible on the water but unmistakable to those waiting along the banks. When the final prow clears it, the Egyptians rise. A ripple of movement cascades across the reed beds as bowstrings draw back in unison. For a breath, time compresses into a single taut instant, and then the arrows fly. They descend in dense volleys, whistling through the air before striking wood, canvas, and flesh. The first arrows tear through sails, dropping them in abrupt folds that engulf deck spaces. Others fracture oars, leaving rowers stunned and unbalanced. Warriors raise shields, but the angle of fire from the embankments gives the Egyptians a decisive advantage. Arrows rain down from above, slipping into gaps between defenses. The invaders shout in confusion, gestures sharp, bodies shifting to absorb the impact of a storm they did not anticipate. The rhythm of the rowing collapses. Ships drift sideways as momentum falters. The Sea People's formation begins to buckle. In that breaking line lies more than a tactical failure. It is the unraveling of their hope to carve a homeland out of Egypt's soil. Egyptian warships surge from hiding. Their hulls slice through shallow water with practiced precision, oars dipping quickly yet silently. These vessels are smaller and more flexible than those of the Sea Peoples. Their commanders steer them into ideal positions, cutting across enemy bows or sweeping up alongside their flanks. Crews move with the coordination of men accustomed to the delta's ever-changing waterways. Each movement is deliberate, rehearsed, grounded in generational knowledge of how battle unfolds on the Nile. The first impact between the fleets is sudden and violent. Egyptian rams strike at weakened points where enemy ships are already listing. Grappling hooks arc through the air, clamping onto railings and binding vessels together. Marines leap the narrow gaps between hulls, shields forward, bronze blades angled for close combat. The clash of metal on wood reverberates across the channel. The Sea Peoples fight with ferocity sharpened by necessity. Their warriors are seasoned by years of migration and conflict, their swords designed for heavy, slashing blows. They meet the Egyptian Marines on the decks with raw strength and desperate resolve. But the confined space works against them. Their broad ships, once useful in open seas, now trap their fighters within tight boundaries. With little room to maneuver, every movement becomes a struggle. Egyptian archers continue their volleys, aiming carefully to avoid their own forces. Arrows strike exposed warriors on enemy decks, further disrupting coordination. The banks, lined with hundreds of archers in layered rows, create a sustained firepower unmatched by anything the Sea Peoples can produce from their swaying vessels. Meanwhile, the underwater obstacles begin to take effect. A heavy sea people's ship pushes forward only to grind violently on submerged stakes. The hull splits along its edge. Water surges into the cavity. Warriors scramble upward as the deck tilts sharply, trying to shift weight and stabilize the vessel. But the trap holds fast. The ship lists, then folds inward, collapsing partially into the shallow bed of the channel. Those who fall into the water struggle against the reeds that wrap around limbs, disorienting them. Egyptian warships seize the opportunity. Several converge on the compromised vessel, forcing enemy fighters to defend from unstable ground. The sound of wood cracking fills the air as the ship breaks under pressure. The battle expands along the channels in a sequence of controlled constrictions. The Egyptians are not relying on raw force alone. They manipulate the environment, using the delta's geography as an extension of their strategy. Warships dart between reeds, striking quickly before pulling back into narrow side passages. Enemy vessels attempt to follow, but become wedged between sandbars or collide with neighboring hulls. Momentum favors Egypt. Confusion spreads through the invaders' ranks as their formation disintegrates. Ramesses III enters the fray at the height of chaos. His royal barge glides into place with measured authority, its presence both symbolic and strategic. The pharaoh stands tall at the bow, bronze armor catching the rising sun. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu later depict him towering above the fray, smiting enemies with divine support. Here, he directs the battle with disciplined precision. He signals archers, redirects warships, and identifies pressure points where Egyptian forces must push harder. His visibility strengthens morale. Every soldier who sees him understands that this battle carries the weight of Egypt's survival. More enemy ships enter the channel, unaware of the disaster unfolding ahead. As they row forward, they encounter a dense congestion of vessels, some crippled, others sinking, many locked in combat. The sea peoples try to reorganize, shouting commands, shifting groups of warriors, and attempting to cut free the grappling hooks binding them to Egyptian warships. But every motion is hindered by the tightness of the channel and the constant barrage from the banks. The rising sun lifts enough to illuminate the water fully. What had been a structured invasion now appears as a mass of floundering hulls and scattered bodies. Shields float past broken oars. The air grows thick with the smell of wet wood and churned mud. Egyptian marines exploit the chaos. They board ship after ship, overwhelming pockets of resistance. Some leap into the water deliberately, swimming across narrow stretches to reach vessels under heavy arrow fire. Their coordination reflects the depths of training maintained by Egypt's military institutions even during periods of strain and famine. At the heart of the channel, a cluster of sea people's ships becomes fatally entangled. Stakes beneath the water hold them fast, while incoming vessels collide with their sterns. Warriors try to force a path through the congestion, but each attempt sends another ship swerving sideways. The Egyptians focus their arrows on this cluster, breaking shields and striking exposed warriors. Flames erupt when pitch pots hurled from warships ignite wooden beams dried by the heat. Smoke coils into the sky, marking the turning point of the battle. The morale of the sea peoples falters. They had entered the delta with confidence shaped by victories across the Mediterranean, but the terrain they now face belongs entirely to their enemy. Their size, their momentum, and their numbers offer no advantage in these narrow waterways. Some attempt to retreat, but the passage behind them has already filled with crippled vessels. Oars cannot find room to swing. Ships reverse only into other ships. The labyrinth the Egyptians prepared becomes a cage tightening with every failed maneuver. Others abandon their vessels and leap into the water, kicking desperately toward the banks. But Egypt anticipated this. Chariot units positioned along the levees move swiftly as swimmers drag themselves through reeds and mud, exhausted and disoriented. Horses thunder across hardened earth. The charioteers act with the same precision displayed on the water, intercepting survivors before they can organize on land. Back in the channels, the Egyptian warships encircle the remaining pockets of resistance. Their movements are slower now, careful to avoid fouling oars on debris or striking submerged stakes. But the outcome is no longer in doubt. The Sea People's surviving warriors, hemmed in by fire, sinking decks, and relentless archery, continue to fall. Some fight to the end. Others drop their weapons in exhaustion. The water becomes the final witness to the battle's closing moments. Ships lean at sharp angles, decks half submerged. Shattered hulls drift without aim. Reed banks bend under the weight of bodies. The sounds of combat diminish until only scattered clashes and the hiss of burning timber remain. Gradually, the Egyptians withdraw from the center of the channel. Archers lower their bows, Marines return to their vessels. Chariot corps remain alert along the banks, watching for stragglers who might attempt escape. The Sea People's fleet, so formidable in open water, lies broken across the delta's constricted labyrinth. What began as an assault dissolves into silence, broken only by the lapping of water against splintered wood. Egypt stands victorious, not through overwhelming numbers, but through mastery of terrain, disciplined coordination, and a strategy shaped by the lessons of collapse raging across the wider world. The delta has done its work, the trap has closed. And as the smoke lifts from the reeds and the sun climbs higher, the surviving Egyptians see more than a battlefield. They see confirmation that the kingdom, battered by uncertainty, still possesses the strength to resist the forces that have toppled empires. The Sea People's advance stops here. The Nile remains Egyptian. When the battle's final echoes faded, the delta settled into a strained and uneasy stillness, its narrow channels thick with the wreckage of a shattered fleet. Smoke drifted over half-sunken hulls, while spears and shields floated in slow circles among broken oars and splintered beams. Egyptian soldiers moved through this debris with deliberate care, stepping across unstable planks, pulling survivors from tangled reeds, and securing prisoners whose exhausted bodies revealed the collapse of both strength and expectation. Among them were women and children, confirming that the Sea Peoples had carried their entire world toward the Nile, intending not to raid, but to settle. The dead were drawn to the banks for counting, while the living were marched inland under guard, destined for resettlement or service in the state's labor and military systems. Ramesses III surveyed the scene with the awareness that this victory needed to be preserved as more than an event. It needed to endure as a statement of Egypt's resilience amid a collapsing age. His order to immortalize the battle at Medinet Habu ensured that the moment of survival would remain carved in stone long after the mud and debris of the delta disappeared. The Battle of the Delta soon became a defining moment in the final centuries of the New Kingdom, a rare instance in which a major Bronze Age power withstood the destabilizing forces that had erased so many of its neighbors. Ramesses III's inscriptions portrayed him as the central figure resisting the tide that had overwhelmed Hatti, Ugarit, and other states. And while the artistic style amplified his presence, the core narrative was accurate. Egypt had faced the same migration-driven pressure that shattered much of the Mediterranean world and had emerged intact. Yet victory did not remove the deeper strains on the kingdom. Economic shortages, disrupted trade routes, and administrative challenges persisted, shaping a slow decline rather than a sudden collapse. Meanwhile, the Sea Peoples did not vanish. Displaced from Egypt's fertile delta, they established themselves instead along the southern Levantine coast, contributing to the formation of new Iron Age societies. Their redirection, rather than their destruction, became part of the battle's legacy. Egypt's endurance shaped the region's future by preserving a major state whose cultural and political presence continued to influence neighboring lands long after its imperial strength had waned. In the broader arc of Mediterranean history, Egypt's survival after the Delta conflict marked it as the final great power of an age otherwise defined by collapse. The reliefs of Medinet Habu, with their carved scenes of capsizing ships and disciplined archers, became enduring symbols of a civilization that refused to yield when surrounded by disorder. Beyond the temple walls, the Nile continued its steady rhythm, flooding fields and supporting communities that had persisted since the earliest dynasties, even as the kingdom slowly transitioned from imperial might to a more fragile continuity. Egypt no longer commanded the vast territories of previous generations, but it retained coherence, identity, and cultural endurance at a time when others fractured entirely. The Sea Peoples, denied the Delta, became part of the new world that formed in the Iron Age. Egypt, though diminished, remained rooted in the old. As the Bronze Age came to its close, the kingdom stood scarred yet unbroken, carrying forward traditions that would echo long after the ruins of its contemporaries fell silent. Its endurance, more than conquest or expansion, became the final measure of its historical stature.